Brooklyn Independent Television.
Hey, it's a big
But
borough.
will Brooklyn really go for
Why
it?
don't we just agree to disagree?
Yeah, that's really gonna fly in
Well, that's a
Brooklyn.
good question.
No. Listen.
That's exactly the point I wanted to make.
One man, one vote is the cornerstone of American democracy. Now, in 1776, the one man with the vote happened to be a white guy who was a property owner. But as much as things have changed since the bad old days when women couldn't vote and black Americans were vote less and only counted as 3/4 of a person, your right to vote may still be at risk because of your gender, your race, or where you live. This is Intersect, and today we're talking voter disenfranchisement. I'm joined by Alex Camarda, the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Citizens Union of New York City, and the League of Women Voters of New York Vice President Emeritus, Adrienne Kivelson. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So voter disenfranchisement, it's a lot of syllables there, but it comes down to a simple principle of your vote not counting or you not even being able to cast one. How much of a danger is it in New York City as we sit here today?
Well, I think the greatest issue facing New Yorkers today is not as much disenfranchisement as actually barriers to voting. Mm-hmm. The election administration machinery today, if you will, is not nearly as modern as it ought to be and trails many other states. Just by way of example, 35 other states have early voting, meaning you can vote on a day other than Election Day in addition to Election Day. In North Carolina, for instance, they are already able to vote in the presidential race. That began on September 6th. Here in New York, you can only vote on November 6th, Election Day. So if the process was opened up a bit more and people could vote on multiple days prior to Election Day, that would make it much easier for people to vote. So there are a lot of things legally that the state needs to change that would encourage more people to participate and remove barriers to voting.
But there was a big noise about our voter machines are coming and they are better than the old paper ballots, no more hanging chads. It's as simple as an ATM.
The New York voting machines are better. They're better than the lever machines. They can be recounted.
Right.
And so we have paper ballots, and the paper ballots can be recounted. So we do have a better system. I agree with Alex. There isn't any disenfranchisement in New York. I think more administrative error. Am I being accurate? Administrative error is what hurts voters on Election Day in New York City. They get an advance notice. They get to their polling place, and there are inexperienced or people who don't know what they're doing. They're given information that sends them traveling all over the city of New York. It's really very frustrating to the voters in New York on Election Day to come to their polls and their name isn't in the book, and every voter has the right to get a provisional ballot, an affidavit ballot, but they're not always told they do. Right. So that's more. I mean, this is a very serious problem all over the country, and because it's a serious problem, disenfranchisement, it impacts on us. But there have been, 20 states have put in or tried to pass legislation that has limited voter participation. New York we haven't had any of that in New York. And in fact, the governor, the Department of Motor Vehicles, recently instituted a program at the governor's direction, which will allow licensed drivers who have an account with the Motor Vehicles Bureau to update their voter information online. So in fact, we're trying, and our groups like Citizens Union, League of Women Voters, are working very hard to try and get some of the barriers that Alex talked about removed.
So a moment ago you spoke about some of the structures that make it a little bit more difficult for people to make their way to the vote. And in some senses you were being very generous because the New York City Board of Elections has been famously plagued with this sort of mismanagement that in some instances, as we heard from City Council member Jumaane Williams, I have a statement that he issued last night on primary night. We're sitting here the day after the primaries, if the results have come in. But the city council member himself said, what I witnessed at the polls today was simply the worst example of voter disenfranchisement I've personally seen. Voters, many of them seniors, were streaming out of polling sites, screaming, cursing, and near tears in over frustration that they experienced. So this is something that he himself witnessed as he was going to make his voting. And it's because people were sent misinformation essentially by the New York City board.
Well, I don't know if they were sent misinformation. In August, every voter got a piece of mailing from which gave the polling place.
Right.
But what happened was, because of redistricting, all poll sites in New York changed for people, and no one is in the same election district, in the same assembly district, and so people tended not to look at what they got in August, and now we're September, whatever it is, and go to the polling place they primarily are used to voting at. Some of them 40 years have been voting in the same place. And they got to the polling place, and lo and behold, they were told they did not vote there. Some of them were sent, and I haven't figured out how they could do this, but they were sent miles away to places they just had no reality. And we got calls in our office, and we tried to say, well, they tell you you're not in the book, get a ballot and vote where you are, because they have to count an affidavit ballot. But I don't know that they were sent misinformation. I think habit of going to polls and poorly trained clerks who met them at the door created a lot of the problem.
Well, I would just add that every election day there's always issues with election administration, and it's hard to know the day after what the root problem is. These questions should be raised, as they are, by the council member and public advocate Bill de Blasio. And so it's incumbent upon the board to respond, and groups like ours to take a closer look at this, scrutinize the situation, and determine if there's a broader systemic problem. I mean, I will say, not to give an excuse to the board, but they have a very challenging endeavor, and that is they have to recruit 35,000 poll workers for an election. And these are essentially temporary workers who go to 6 hours of training and may work the primary and then the general election. And to recruit many qualified people for what is really a one-day job that pays a couple $100 in those numbers is really something that's very challenging to do.
It is challenging and frustrating when it doesn't happen, when all you want to do is vote, and you're met with a wall of sort of incompetence when you say, okay, do I belong here? Where can I vote? And leave feeling like maybe my vote didn't count. Is it going to make its way too? Is my voice going to be heard? There
were further complicating factors. There was no election in every area. So some people went to vote where there was no election, and when they were told, well, no, you don't have a race, some of them felt that they were not being told the truth, and they were missing a vote. So that was another problem. We tried, and the board has actually tried to alleviate that problem by putting a sample ballot online, and voters can look online to see where they're supposed to vote.
By keying in your zip code,
your address, your specific address,
street address,
and they'll see where they're supposed to vote. And you can also draw down a sample ballot. And when there was no race, the ballot said there is no race in your district. Now, unfortunately, I mean, when people called our office, I'm sure Citizens Union and the other, we looked this up for them. We told them most people, particularly elderly people, do not have computer access, and so they didn't see this. And that just added to what is
a level of frustration.
What is normally a problem. It just added to it. And then I had somebody call up and say, well, they were discriminating against me because I was a registered Democrat, and they said my name wasn't in the book, but the man next to me was a Republican and he voted. And I was trying to explain there wasn't a Democratic contest, but there was a Republican contest. So.
We find that confusion is elevated during the primary when you'll have particular contests but not others, and I think people assume the worst, particularly in communities of color where there's a long history of voter disenfranchisement, and people have heard about the incompetence of the board in daily news editorials and so forth, and so many voters automatically assume that there's something suspicious at play, something malevolent at play, and maybe there is, maybe there isn't. We don't really know until after the election and these issues are looked at more closely.
So whether it's founded or not, what should one do if they do feel like they've been confronted with a barrier to themselves voting? Whether they said the Republican got to vote and I didn't vote, and it was justifiably so, but what should your next step be if you feel like you've been
Well, you can always cast an affidavit ballot. There are phone numbers, 311. You can call the Board of Elections. You can call groups like ours. hours. Those are all important things to do the day of. As Adrienne mentioned, prior to Election Day, you should go on the Board of Elections website, look at your poll site locator. It will tell you where you're supposed to go. Look at your ballot. You can, do research on the candidates in the race, and that's something our group and others have advocated for. We recently worked with the board on revamping their website and to include something called email updates so that people can go provide their email voluntarily to the board, and the board will now send them emails letting them know the last day to register is approaching, the last day to get an absentee ballot is approaching, your sample ballot is online. So people get the notification and don't think of these things on Election Day when it's much more difficult to address.
Yeah, we have something with the league called Vote 411, which is on our website, where we give all of the races, we connect to the poll site locator, and we offer the candidates an opportunity to make a statement of what their principles are. So you can look that up online, or you can call the league office and we'll read off the names for the candidates in your district. I want to emphasize what Alex said. I tell people no one should leave a poll without voting. That you really should insist on getting an affidavit ballot, and it then goes back to the board if it's for review to see if you're in the right place. If it is not, if your vote is not, they let you know. If they say you're not registered now, because of things we worked for, the affidavit ballot now serves as a voter registration form, and you are now duly registered. So when I go around, I say, do not leave that poll site without voting. And then, in addition to calling us and calling Citizens Union, call your council person. I mean, because the council
they're eager to hear.
Oh, they're eager to hear about it. And I know I can't. We're going to be at an oversight hearing that the Councilman Williams will co-sponsor with the chair of the Government Operations Committee. We're sure there will be. Each time there's an oversight hearing in the council on the conduct of the elections. So everybody wants to hear about this because nobody wants to let this go on. We send a letter to the board. We're working on it, start working on it tomorrow with all the complaints that we got, with the ED, the AD, and all the information we can provide so that before November, the problems that voters encountered can be resolved. That's the
much in the same vein, Alex, you mentioned earlier the city, the public advocate, the guy who's out there fighting for the public in your best interest, released 3 guidelines or directives that he would urge the Board of Elections to follow. Among them is to verify that all poll site information mailed to voters prior to November's election is up to date and accurate. And 2, to ensure that poll site workers are sufficiently trained and informed about redistricting changes that can direct voters to their correct polling site on Election Day. And lastly, to provide an efficient and clear affidavit voting process that you were just speaking about that can be cast on Election Day. So voters facing a hardship to other polling sites can still cast a vote. But speaking of those other polling sites, we have to rewind a little. The last time we talked about sort of votes and them getting lost was centered around the issue of these district changes that seem to have been a bit of a gotcha yesterday for people showing up at places that they may have been voting, like you said, for 40 years. And hey, guess what? Your district doesn't exist anymore, so you have to move. But I know that Citizens Union has been doing a lot of work about this redistricting at the state level. So we talked about LAT4 last time, but now JCOPE is the new thing. So unpack JCOPE for me, Alex.
So JCOPE is the new ethics body that was created in 2011 as part of a revamping of the Ethics Commission for the state. And many of our groups supported this change. I think what's most significant about it is for the first time ever you have an entity outside of the legislature that will investigate not only the executive branch but the legislative branch. So for example, JCOPE, everyone is talking about the investigation that we know is occurring of Assemblymember Vito Lopez for allegations of sexual harassment. And that's the first time an entity outside the legislature will be looking at potential ethical misconduct. Prior to this law, that would have been handled by the legislature internally, as it was by an assembly ethics committee, where this is an instance where there's dual jurisdiction. But to have an outside entity within the government also look at that as a good check on the conduct of legislators. And we also know that there are others looking at this as well, district attorneys and so forth.
I just want to add that we had state redistricting, and we had serious problems with the way it was done and the partisan nature. Citizens Union and the League were together with other groups on this. Now we're going to have city council redistricting. So now you're in a new assembly district and you're in a new state senatorial district, and in 213 you're going to be in a new council district.
Right.
But the council districting is done differently. It is not done by the council.
Right.
It's done by a body of broadly based body of appointments from council leaders and the mayor, and there has to be a balance on the panel, and they're now going through the process of redrawing the city council lines. So that's the next election, and we're hopeful that we think it's a much better process than the state's process.
It is, but what we'll likely see is some of the same frustration that you highlighted today, where people, because they're unfamiliar with the changes, or maybe the board has not done an adequate job in notifying them, we'll probably see in the council races next year, which there'll be many open seats and many candidates running in, voters going to their poll site that they've gone to for the previous decade, and then it will be different because the lines have been recalibrated to reflect changes in population. So that's something that could arise again. It's a problem that occurred this year with the state legislative races, but we'll likely see it next year as well.
But I'd like to raise something about what the public advocate raised in terms of the mailings that go out from the Board of Elections before Election Day. Right. Am I correct? There has been no agreement that there will be a mailing.
The board is only obligated to do a mailing once prior to the primary and not between the primary and the general election. And it's something groups like ours who want to see turnout increase have encouraged. But the reality is it also costs close to $2 million. All those stamps and all those registered voters.
What else are you doing with the money besides telling people when and where and giving them the information on who wants their vote?
Well, the problem, again, we're not here to defend the Board of Elections, and it's certainly the last thing I want to do. But this year, the Board of Elections ran something like 5 elections, and we had what we think is believe is really a wasteful congressional primary in June, and then a September primary for state offices. We would have liked to see the whole thing in June. We have special elections. And the budget does not cover all those elections. So basically, what happens? They go in with a budget. Which we can all argue about, and then the city comes back and makes them whole because you can't anticipate the special election. Right. So there really is a budget issue, and there may be a different way to budget for the Board of Elections that's a little more realistic and should be explored. But the fact of the matter is there isn't any money in the budget for that second mailing, which we all believe, particularly in a presidential year, is crucial.
Yeah, how do you not?
And so we would hope that somewhere and some entity will find the money for such a mailing, because we agree with the public advocate that people get something in August, they didn't remember it in September, they're certainly not going to remember it in November.
And if the state legislature had passed legislation that enabled the congressional elections, which were held in June, and the elections yesterday to be held on the same day, we would have saved $20+ million, and you could have obviously done multiple mailings to alert people to the fact that an election was coming up. So, and that's something that's very important, because what we're finding, and it really begins in the 1960s, and this is true across the country, turnout is on a slow decline, and in the city in the 2000s for municipal elections, we saw some of the worst turnout that we've seen in decades, really since the 1920s. And so with regard to turnout, in the last mayoral race, only 28% of registered voters turned out. In the last 3 federal elections dating back to 2006, the average turnout was 42%, which ranks New York State 47th among 50 states. So it's a real problem.
It's ridiculous that New York City would be almost at the very bottom of people who actually take the initiative to get out and just pull the lever, press the button, and just vote for your elected officials.
Well, part of the problem is, we think with state redistricting, is that to a certain extent it's an incumbent. Because the legislature redistricts itself, it protects incumbents. So incumbents have an enormous advantage, and people...
And they don't want new people coming out.
Well, the people say, it doesn't make any difference. And we try to get the point across that it always makes a difference, because there's no other way in a democracy to change anything than by voting. You don't have any other recourse. So when you don't vote, you're voting, because you're giving somebody else your vote.
But it seems as if the real bar to participation in elections is apathy. Then that's the biggest threat that we may face.
Not quite. I mean, there are a number of registration barriers that could be removed. For instance, you can't register within 25 days of an election. You have to do it 25 days in advance. So a lot of people, just as they're tuning into the election, they realize they're not registered. We still do this through very antiquated paper forms, what Adrienne mentioned about the governor's advancement with online registration was only done in the last couple weeks. You know, we commend the governor for that. We think it's a significant step forward. But it also only applies to people who already have driver's licenses or non-driver's ID. And I think one area that the city actually could work to improve registration, because a lot of these issues are controlled by the state, is to look at their own agencies, which are required to register people who come for services. You know, they're not going primarily for voter registration. They're coming there for other services.
Whether you get a library card or aid to women with infant children, there's a number of city services that they already have every bit of information about your life.
Exactly.
So
And this information could be transmitted electronically once people register at the agency where they get services to the Board of Elections. There's some signature requirements that need to be overcome, but it can be done, and I think that's something the mayor and the council could tackle and really increase the number of people who are registered, and by extension, hopefully improve turnout.
And it's just as important as calorie counts and the amount of ounces of a drink that you get to buy while we're spending so much political capital and time on that. Why not get people registered to vote?
We are also, with the Citizens Union, supporting a bill in the City Council that would provide voter registration information and forms to people as they register their children for school, and we think that's really an untapped source in many ways, and it's really a low voting population as well. It's unfortunate because so much of public education that affects their children, but parents of children in schools have so many things on their plate that voting is not really a high priority, or registering is not a high priority. So we're hoping that using every resource we can to get information out about registering to vote will help this. We also think there's a law, if you want to change your party designation in New York City, you literally have to do it before the previous year's election. So if you want to vote, if you're registered as an independent and you want to vote in the Democratic primary for mayor, I'm just using that as an example, in 2013, October 12th is the last day that you can change your registration to October 12th, 2012 is the last day you can change your registration. We think that's excessive. And so there are things like that we think.
And speaking of young people, I think one of the things that few people know about, your viewers may not know this, if you're 17 years old, you can actually pre-register to vote. So you can fill out a form, send this to the Board of Elections, and then when you turn 18, you'll be ready to vote. Last year in New York City, we have 8.5 million people, 1.1 million school children, obviously some of whom are 17. We had 11 people in the entire city pre-register to vote who are 17 years old. So that's something that could be dramatically improved, and we know that young people tend to have lower voter turnout rates as compared to senior
citizens.
And
it's simply too because no one knows. Who knew that you could pre-register?
Well, you have to be
17?
18 by December 31st of the year in which you. But we go into high schools and we do voter registration drives in high schools, and when you go there and you help, I mean, the kids are not only willing, they're anxious to do it. There isn't enough outreach now. Every high school graduate, and I believe they still do it, although I thought it was a waste of money because 11 people fill them out. Every high school graduate gets a voter registration form with your diploma. The 11 people, I didn't know that number. That sort of proves that's unless you do some voter education, and that's the other piece.
Well, I would question whether the schools are actually, I mean, they're required by law to give out a registration form at the same time and in the same manner as students receive their diplomas. And I would just question whether that's happening at all. I think it's something the city should look into.
Well, what about the future of voting? Everyone, you'll turn on any TV show the day after the election and there'll be some person bemoaning the fact that more people voted for American Idol than voted for the president. What about moving this whole process forward?
Someday you might be able to get to online, but we're not quite there yet. But I think another place to look is we believe that there's a lack of civics education in the schools, And not only aren't you teaching it, you have a generation of teachers who never had civics education in the schools. So that we think that that's where it starts, that we work very hard to get the vote for 18-year-olds, but there isn't an equal amount of education going on to these kids in high schools on why it's important to vote and what voting means. It's not necessarily, they learn a lot about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, but they really don't do a lot of civics education in the schools. We think it's absolutely a crucial step in order to get a generation.
Right, just basic structure stuff about how the lights come on when you flip the switch in your city.
Right, yeah.
It's interesting you bring up American Idol. I mean, there are other states that are doing things that are very different than here. I mean, for example, in Oregon, they don't even actually go to the polls. Everything's done by mail. So all voting is done by mail. They make sure that the voting is secure through these barcodes on the actual ballot or the envelopes that are received by the voters. So there they don't even go to polls. In North Dakota, they don't even have registration. So I think New York State really needs to look to other states and look at the more modern things they're doing to kind of update the way in which we go about registering and voting.
The number is 212-725-3541. And there's the league website, which is lwvnyc.org. And then Vote 411, as I explained, which has a lot of information on the current election, is just vote411.org.
And it's the League of Women Voters.
And it's the League of Women Voters of the City of New York.
Alex, where can we find Citizens Union?
So Citizens Union, our number is 212-227-0342. My extension is 24 if you want to call me directly. We also have a website, citizensunion.org. We have a voter guide that we provide to voters for both the primary and we'll do again for the general election. New Yorkers can go on our website and look at the actual guide we provide that summarizes interviews we've done with candidates and who we recommend they should vote for.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing. We hope that your voting yesterday or on primary day, whenever you happen to be watching this, went smoothly. But if it didn't, don't be disheartened. Get in touch with these guys and they'll get you on the path. So thanks for watching Intersect, and I'd like to thank my guest, Alex Camarda of Citizens Union of the City of New York, and from the League of Women Voters of New York City, Vice President Emeritus Adrienne Kivelson. We'll see you next time. Bye now.
Watch this and other Brooklyn Independent Television episodes online at bricartsmedia.org/BIT.